Hi everyone, we're going to discuss Chapter 38, and this is for corporations, their formation and financing for Business Law 2. First, we're going to discuss the characteristics of corporations. The corporation is a legal entity that is separate from its shareholders. The corporation has rights as a person and a citizen. Courts have held that corporations are persons and thus have a right to due process. Courts also consider corporations to be persons with respect to the Fourth Amendment and therefore are protected from unreasonable searches and seizures. Finally, corporations are protected under the First Amendment and commercial speech is protected, but to a lesser degree than corporate political speech. Corporations are a creature of the state. Statutes within each state have guidelines for creating corporations, and they create a contract between that corporation and the state. Generally, shareholders can freely transfer their corporate shares, and corporations may exist perpetually as outlined in their articles of incorporation. There is a centralized management. There is a board of directors who select officers who then manage the day-to-day business. There is taxation. Dividends are paid to shareholders, and then they pay taxes on those dividends they receive. Corporations are subject to double taxation. This means the corporation itself is taxed and then a second time when the earnings are paid to the shareholders. As it concerns liability for officers and employees, corporations are liable for torts and crimes committed by their agents during the scope of their employment, and this is referred to as respondeat superior or vicarious liability. So now we're going to talk about corporate powers, and the first thing we'll cover are the express powers. These are powers that are granted to corporations via statutory law or their articles of incorporation. So that would be the possibility to perpetually exist, depending if the jurisdiction limits those terms, the power to sue or be sued, the power to acquire property, to make contracts, to borrow and lend money, the power to make charitable donations, to establish rules for managing the corporation. There are implied powers of a corporation, and any powers necessary to execute its express powers and the power given in the corporate purpose that is listed in the Articles of Incorporation. Here we're going to talk about corporate classifications. The first is public or private. The public corporations have public duties, for instance, FDIC. There are also private companies that do not have government duties. There's also profit or nonprofit corporations. For profit is when the shareholders are purchasing stock that these corporations issue in order to profit. Nonprofits may earn a profit, but they do not distribute them amongst shareholders. Most of the profit is reinvested back into the corporation. This is a church, for instance, or a charitable organization. There's also the domestic, foreign, or alien corporation classification. And the domestic corporation is the state where it is incorporated. If they operate in other states, they obtain a certificate of authority and are considered a foreign corporation to that state. Then there's the alien corporations, and these are corporations incorporated in another country. This is for corporation classifications continued. There's the publicly held corporation, and this is when stock is available to the public to purchase and invest in the corporation. Shareholders may sell their stocks or keep the money invested in their shares. There is also the closely held corporation. These corporations generally do not offer stock to the general public. The shareholders are usually family members and friends, and this is to prevent outsiders from gaining too much control of the corporation. There's the S corporation. They are able to deduct corporate losses from their personal income, which reduces their taxes in case of loss. They cannot have more than 100 shareholders. No shareholders may be non-resident aliens, and they may only issue one class of shares. There's the professional corporations. This is either a group of dentists, doctors, or other professionals who wish to practice as a corporation. How are corporations formed? There are promoters, who are individuals who bring about the creation of the corporation by arranging for necessary capital, financing, and licenses. Subscription agreements are agreements in which the investor agrees to purchase stock in the new corporation. Subscribers are investors who agree to purchase stock in the new corporation. They pick a state for incorporation, they look at the tax rates, the flexibility for management of the corporation, rights given to the shareholder, restrictions placed on distribution of dividends, and protections against stakeholders. The legal process of incorporation includes the selection of a corporate name. Incorporators apply for incorporation on behalf of the corporation. Articles of incorporation are drafted, and the corporation holds an organizational meeting. Here we're going to talk about Wachovia Securities versus Banco Panamericano. The facts are as follows. This case explores when the corporate veil should be pierced. Greenblatt is the sole officer, director, and employee of Banco Panamericano, and also an officer of Loop Corporation. In January 2000, Banco gave Loop a $9.9 million line of credit. Afterwards, some Loop subsidiaries used the line of credit to advance $3 million to Loop for secured credit status over Loop. Later, Loop opened a margin account with Prudential, which was succeeded by Wachovia. Loop used the account to buy shares in HMRI, which later collapsed. Wachovia issued a margin call on the Loop account and liquidated it, but a $1.8 million debt remained. The issue before the court was as follows. Can the corporate veil be pierced to hold defendants personally liable for corporate debts? The procedural history. A trial court held that Greenblatt and the other officers of Loop were personally liable. The defendants then appealed to a higher court. The holding of the higher court was as follows. They affirmed the lower court's decision, and they held that the defendants were in fact liable. The reasoning is as follows. Wachovia alleged that Loop was essentially just a front used by Greenblatt and the other officers to escape personal liability. To evaluate this allegation, the court used a two-pronged test to determine if there was a unity in the interest and ownership such that the corporation and the individuals were essentially one, and that treating them otherwise would sanction fraud. The court found the business activities of Loop and its officers to be highly abnormal and indicative of a corporation that existed solely to shield its officers from liability. The court found that Loop was thinly financed and it lacked corporate minutes and accounting records, that the compensation to its officers was abnormal and off the books, that Loop paid $1.2 million to insiders or related entities, and other suspicious activities perpetuated by Loop. What are some of the problems with the formation of corporations? First, there is a de jure corporation, and this is in fact when a corporation has actually met all of the substantial elements of the incorporation process. So no problem there per se. There's the de facto corporation. This is a corporation that does not substantially meet the requirements of the incorporation statute, but is recognized for most purposes as a corporation. Then we have the piercing of the corporate veil, which is the case that we discussed in the previous slide, and that occurs when the corporate status is ignored after an owner has attempted to hide behind the corporate status to protect himself or them from personal liability. How are corporations financed? Debt securities or bonds. These are usually long-term loans on which the corporations promises to pay interest. They list a maturity date on which the corporation must repay the face on the amount of the loan. There's equity securities. These are stock owners own a part of the corporation in the form of shares of stock called equity securities. Stockholders have a voice in the firm's control. There's the common stock and the preferred stock. A common stock is when the owner is entitled to corporate dividends in proportion to the number of shares he or she owns and has a right to vote in corporate elections. Each share is usually worth one vote. Common stock owners have the lowest priority when a corporation distributes dividends. There's the preferred stock. These stockholders enjoy preferences in the distribution of assets and dividends. They usually receive a percentage of dividends associated with the face value of their preferred stock, and they will receive dividends before the owners of common stock. Sometimes corporations limit preferred stock owners' voting rights.